How do people change over the lifespan? How do you go from little baby shoes, okay? How do you go from little baby shoes to playing with Lightning McQueen or Buzz Lightyear, okay? How do you go from that to wanting the car keys, to getting married, to celebrating 50 years together? How does that happen? And why are psychologists interested in that? Lifespan development is how people's behavior and how people change throughout the lifespan. Okay. Normally people thought of lifespan development as child development. Basically the baby shoes, thinking of little babies and when they learn how to crawl, when they learn how to say words. Traditionally, developmental psych was child development, but it has expanded to lifespan, to not only the things like baby shoes and things like learning your letters and numbers, to marriage, death and dying. What are the things that we look at and why are psychologists interested in it? Well, psychologists are interested in it because it affects human behavior. A baby acts different than a 2-year-old, acts different than a 5-year-old, acts different than a 10-year-old, acts different than a teenager. People act, their developmental stage has an impact on their development. And that's what lifespan development is all about. That being said, there are some big issues in lifespan development. One of them is continuity versus discontinuity. And that's the idea of, is development continuous? In other words, do people learn to communicate little by little, or is it leaps and bounds? Do they stay flat and then boom? Do people grow little by little, gradually, or by leaps and bounds? In the end, it's a little bit of both. It's whether you look at it in terms of macro versus micro, versus little bits versus the entirety. If you look at little bits, it looks more gradual. If you look at the broad picture, you can see some jumps. You can see jumps in early childhood and jumps at puberty, for instance. So continuity versus discontinuity. Another big issue in lifespan development is universality. And it's the idea of, does everyone go through the same things? In other words, learning how to walk. Do kids all over the world learn how to walk at about the same age? Do these little shoes have an effect? Do kids that don't have baby shoes learn how to walk the same as kids who do, for instance? Basically, it's that universality. Is it universal? Or is it culturally specific? And that leads a little bit into the last one, which is nature versus nurture. Are changes over the lifespan due to genetics or environment? Is somebody genetically programmed to end up getting married? Is somebody genetically programmed to do something? And no matter what happens, are they going to do that? Or is it totally environment? In the end, we're going to find out almost everything is a mix of both. People are born with genetic predispositions and tendencies, but their environment determines how those genetic predispositions and tendencies are played out. So we have nature versus nurture, universality, and continuity. With that, there are a number of big theorists. There are 4 big theorists that we kind of want to focus on. There are others, but 4 big ones that are in lifespan development. Freud, Erikson, Piaget, and Kohlberg. Freud has a psychosexual theory. He has this theory of where do people get pleasure at different times of their lives. That's where when you hear the terms anal and anal retentive, and when you hear the term Oedipus complex, that's where that came from. Basically, he says that kids start out and it's the oral stage. Little babies put things in their mouths and explore stuff with their mouths. Then toddlers get into what's called the anal stage, and it's all about potty training. And this is where Freud, yes, he did. He said the way you're potty trained affects your personality. And that's where you get that anal retentive thing, as how lax were your parents in potty training you. Then you have the phallic stage, and that's where preschoolers learn that they have private parts. And in fact, sometimes it feels good to touch their private parts. You see little boys where you have to tell them don't touch. Freud was interested in that kind of stuff. And during that stage, that's what he calls the phallic stage. That's the stage where he said children identify with their same-sex parents because they have a desire for the opposite-sex parents. Now, the stuff like that, the whole undertone, is not really looked at that much anymore. But the whole idea of parts of the body, you can kind of think about that. And gender identification. You can kind of think about those couple things in Freud's theory. But anyway, after the phallic stage, then there's a latency stage and genital stage. That's Freud's theory. So Freud, number one. Bigger in lifespan development, bigger than Freud, is a person named Erikson, Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson is really important because Erikson had what's called a lifespan stage theory. He looked at not just children. He looked at people across the lifespan and said, what are tasks that they need to accomplish? And psychosocial. He talked about really these psychological tasks. They're kind of that in between social and psychological. And you'll see why as we go through them. But basically he's saying that as you go through life, there's certain tasks you have to accomplish in order to be successful. Number one, babies need to learn to trust. Trust versus mistrust. Babies need to know that there's someone they can trust to take care of them because they can't take care of themselves. Do they have to trust everybody? No. In fact, it's probably not healthy to trust everybody. But they have to realize to develop in a healthy way, they have to have at least one person that they can trust to take care of their basic needs. Babies. Then you get to toddlerhood. And you figured out there's somebody you can trust. Now it's like, I don't want you to do it. I want to do it myself. So do it myself is the mantra of toddlerhood. And that's autonomy. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this is idea of, do they feel like they can do some stuff by themselves, or is everybody always doing stuff for them? Do they feel ashamed and feel like they can't do anything? That's autonomy versus shame and doubt. Then we have initiative. Preschoolers, once they figure out they can do stuff by themselves, they want it to be their idea. They don't want to be told what to do. Toddlers, as long as they can do it by themselves, sometimes they're fine. But preschoolers want it to be their idea. They want to come up with the plan. They want to do it. So that's initiative. Then we have school-age kids. Industry versus inferiority. School-age kids, okay, they've learned to trust. They've learned that they can do some things by themselves. They've learned to take the initiative. Now they want to learn to complete things, to be productive, to be industrious. Industry versus inferiority. That's the preschool stage. That's the school age stage, sorry. That's school age. They're starting to learn to read and write, learn to do math. They're getting grades. They're playing on sports teams and scoring goals and hitting the ball. They want to accomplish things. They want to produce. That's industry versus inferiority. Then you have adolescence. Adolescence is identity versus role confusion. Identity, you might think of identity as what do you want to do for a career? Okay, but identity is more than that. Identity, for instance, can be relationships. And am I a person who's going to want to get married? Am I a person who's going to want a monogamous relationship? Identity could be gaming. What do I like to do? What are my pastimes? Am I somebody who's a gamer or not? Could be something simple like that. Identity could be something even deeper, like spiritual identity, in terms of I've been going to church with my parents all my life, but am I just going because my parents told me to go, or am I going because it's something I truly believe myself? That's what adolescents and young adults, there's a stage called emergent adulthood, which is kind of between adolescent and young adult, are going through. They have to decide, kind of separate themselves from their parents and decide, is this something I truly believe, or am I just going through the motions? You find that a lot I find that a lot with college students, that they really have to think hard on that. And they go to college and they don't have mom or dad telling them to do stuff. So they have to decide, is this something I really want or not? And they make their own decisions. That's establishing an identity. And Erikson said that that is adolescence. Because we see an increased in a lengthening of adolescence in the United States, you see that in young adults, like college students also. So we have adolescence is identity. Then young adulthood, and this is generally from like 18 or 20 to about 35, 40, is intimacy versus isolation. The task of young adulthood is to find that significant other, so you figured out who you are. Now you need to share that with somebody in a significant relationship. That's Erikson's task in young adulthood, intimacy. Okay, so young adulthood is intimacy. Then you get to be middle-aged. Middle-aged. What happens when you get to be in your 40s and 50s? Generativity versus stagnation. It's, okay, so I figured out who I am, and I've shared that with another person. Now I'm going to pass that on to future generations. I'm going to pass on my wisdom and skills and knowledge and stuff to future generations. That can be done in a number of ways. You see middle-aged adults doing that through families, through having kids and teaching their kids and passing on their wisdom and ideas to them. You see people doing it through work, training people to do their jobs, training the newbies. You see that through volunteer programs, through Big Brother, Big Sister, through tutoring programs, through mentor programs. You see that a lot through coaching Little League. That's the kind of thing that you see middle-aged adults doing, passing on stuff to the future generation. That's what Erikson said was healthy. That's their task. That's something, in order to pass through middle adulthood, that's healthy development. And then when you get to old age, integrity versus despair. This idea of looking back at your life and saying, did I do for the most part what I set out to do? That does not mean that they had to do everything that they set out to do. That does not mean that they don't have any regrets whatsoever. It means realistically looking at your life and saying, yeah, for the most part, I did what I wanted to do. For the most part, I led a really good life. For the most part, I led a good life. Was it all roses? No. There's some things I regret. There's some things I did wrong, but I'm okay. I'm okay with it. I'm okay with how I've lived my life. I've learned from it, basically. Looking at your life and saying, okay, I'm proud of what I did good, and I've learned from what I haven't. That's integrity versus despair. That's Erikson, sort of going through the entire lifespan, and these are the tasks that you need to complete. So we've talked about Freud, Erikson, Piaget. You can't do developmental psych without talking about Piaget. Piaget is the theorist when it comes to cognitive development. He had a theory that mainly focused on kids and said kids go through very stage-like theory. Kids go through 4 stages. Sensory motor, which is babies and toddlers, where kids are learning stuff through their senses. They're putting things in their mouths, they're throwing stuff off the high chair to see how it falls, they're kicking the mobile to see what they get, see what sounds they can make, so on and so forth. They learn from their senses. Then you have preschoolers who have learned language, who have learned symbols. And that's the difference between sensory motor and pre-operational. Pre-operational, they don't have what Piaget called operations yet. Their thought isn't completely logical yet. But they are able to handle some symbols. That's pre-operational, mostly preschool, from the ages of about 3 to 7. And at this stage, believe it or not, it's known for more what kids can't do than what they can. They can use symbols. They can understand, for instance, the McDonald's sign means McDonald's. The big things that they can't do. They're still pretty egocentric in terms of they have trouble taking other people's perspectives. Now, you start seeing a little bit about 5 and 6, some theory of, we'll talk about theory of mind. You start seeing that a little bit at age 5 and 6, but for the most part, if you look at real preschoolers, they have trouble taking other people's perspective. A typical 3-year-old can call you on the phone and be like, oh, look at my new shirt. But they're not thinking, that person can't see my new shirt. I can see my new shirt, but that person is somewhere else. They're not thinking that far. They're not logical enough. That's the egocentrism. Another big thing in pre-operational is what's called lack of conservation. Conservation is sort of things staying the same. If I laid out, and you can watch the videos, you can watch a video if you look at conservation pre-operational, videos will come up showing this. There's a couple different classics. One is quarters, where you take a 4-year-old and you lay out a certain number of quarters and in front of you and in front of them, and you say, okay, do you have more, I have more, or do we both have the same? And if they're laid out the same, they will say, oh, we have the same. And then one of the rows you spread out. So you acknowledge they have the same and they know there's the same. Then one of the rows you physically spread out and you say, okay, now, do we still have the same? You have more, I have more. They'll think the row that's more spread out has more, because they can't look at how long it is and how many at the same time. Another classic is the liquid, conservation of liquids. You have 2 cups that have the same amount of liquid, and you talk to the preschooler and you acknowledge, you say, do both of these have the same amount? And they look and they investigate it and they're like, yeah, they have the same amount. Then you take one of them and you pour them into a taller, thinner glass. Pour it into the taller, thinner glass. You don't add any more liquid, you don't take it away, you just take the liquid and pour it. Older kids and adults would say, yeah, they still have the same. Little kids, preschoolers, will say that the tall, thin one has more because the level of the liquid is higher. They have trouble looking at both the width and the height at the same time. This is why in preschools you have the dreaded breaking of the cookies. You pass out cookies and somebody's cookie breaks. He has more, she has more, because they have 2 and I have 1. They don't realize that it's the same amount. That's pre-operational. That's Piaget's pre-operational thinking. So you go from that to concrete operations. Concrete operations is from about 7 to 11, 12-ish. And this is where kids have logical thinking. In other words, they understand conservation. They understand that other people have different perspectives. In other words, they understand, oh, she can't see my shirt. Okay, physically, I can see my shirt. Physically, her eyes are somewhere else. She can't see my shirt. They understand take this game and break it, it won't work. They understand things that are very logical and concrete. That is 7 to 12. The issue is, and they can do the conservation tasks. You take the liquid and pour it in a different cup. Yeah, it has the same amount. You didn't change it. It has the same amount. They get it. What they don't get is things that are abstract and hypothetical. There's a classic thing that says, okay, let's pretend if you hit a rock with a feather, the rock will break. What happens if you hit a rock with a feather? Well, a school-age child will say, nothing. Feathers can't break rocks. They're very concrete. They know that feathers can't break rocks. If you get an older child, a teenager or an adult would say, okay, ha, 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 the rock will break. In other words, they can do the hypotheticals. If you say, for instance, if pigs could fly, how long would it take a pig to get from Columbus to Cincinnati? And a school-age kid would say, but pigs can't fly. A teenager or an adult might say, if pigs could fly, an airplane takes about an hour, but pigs might be slower, so maybe like an hour and a half. I mean, they could figure it out. That's the difference. So we have pre-operational where there's some logic flaws. Concrete operations where things that are concrete and that they've had experience with and logic they can do, but not real abstract hypotheticals. Then you have formal operations. Formal operations is when you get to about 12 years old, and that's when kids thinking starts to get more adult-like, according to Piaget. It's called formal operations, and it's where you can think in hypotheticals, you can think more abstractly, you can think about justice, love, mercy, these concepts, which you really were hard to pin down when you were younger. That's the difference, and that's Piaget. Again, sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operations, form operations. The other theorist that I wanted to go over was, before we get to the specific stages within the lifespan, was Kohlberg. Kohlberg looked at what's called moral reasoning. And he looked at, if you say something's right or wrong, why? Let's say my kid decided to, let's say a teenager decided to, they really wanted to see their boyfriend or girlfriend, and their parents said no, and their boyfriend or girlfriend, they felt like they really needed them. And so they lied to their parents and told them they were someplace else and went to go see their boyfriend or girlfriend. Well, was that the right thing to do or not, and why? Kohlberg wouldn't look as much as whether they said it was right or not, but they would look at the explanation. So let's say, was it right to lie to your parents? Let's say a kid said, no, because I'm going to get caught and I'm going to get in trouble. Or yes, because I can get away with it. That is Kohlberg's stage 1, pre-conventional, because it's looking at rewards and punishments. In other words, it's wrong because I'm going to get punished. Or it's right because I'm going to get a reward. Because I'll get to be with my boyfriend or girlfriend and I'll get that advantage and nothing's going to happen. It's all about me. That's the pre-conventional. It's all about whether you're going to get punished or not. It's punishment, reinforcement, operant conditioning, all about me. The second stage, conventional, is more about societal rules and or relationships. Yes, it was right because my boyfriend or girlfriend needed me. No, it was wrong because you don't lie to your parents. It's going to make your parents mad. Or you're going to lose trust. Their parents aren't going to trust you anymore. That's conventional. Thinking about the relationship, it's that step farther. Okay, thinking about the relationship or thinking about societal rules. post-conventional is even more sophisticated. It was like, yes, it was right to lie because even though it would make my parents trust me less, it was more important to help out my boyfriend or girlfriend. Thinking about both. Or the idea of love and commitment to a boyfriend or girlfriend is more important than the commitment to a parent, or vice versa. In other words, it's wrong to lie to your parents because your parents are going to have that relationship forever, whereas a boyfriend or girlfriend could only be transitory. So that's the universal, that's this, you're thinking about universal principles and comparing things to one another. It's more sophisticated. That is post-conventional. So that's Kohlberg. Kohlberg is known for this thing called the Heinz dilemma, which is this thing about a guy whose wife was really sick, and he tried to get medicine to save her, and the pharmacist wouldn't was selling it for a price that he couldn't afford, and he tried to negotiate, and the pharmacist said no, and he ended up stealing it, and the question is, was he right to steal it? And what Kohlberg looked at was the answers. Yes, it was right because. No, it was wrong because. It's the because. That's Kohlberg. Okay, so those are the main theorists. But what exactly, if we look at each stage and the lifespan, what exactly happens? We can go from newborns. Well, this isn't newborn, but babies. Actually, it starts even before that. It starts with prenatal development. Prenatal development, there's basically 3 stages. There is the germinal, embryonic, and fetal stages of development. Germinal is from conception to implantation. Embryonic is from implantation till about week 8. And then fetal is from about week 8 until birth. What's interesting with prenatal development is that a lot of development happens during that embryonic period from about, during the germinal and embryonic period. The major organs are formed before week 8. If you look at sort of the developmental critical stages in development, your brain is being formed, your heart, your lungs, the major organs are all formed, which is kind of scary because a lot of that happens before people even know they're pregnant. And there's things called teratogens, which are things that can affect the developing baby. There are things that are obvious, like alcohol and nicotine and illegal drugs. But it's more complicated than that. I mean, that's one of the simple things. I mean, think about fetal alcohol syndrome, and how many of you have been told a pregnant person is not supposed to drink? Yeah. It's this thing of, yes, if you're pregnant, don't drink. Now, if you find out you're pregnant, don't worry if you find out you're pregnant and you're like, I had 1 glass of wine 2 days ago. Chances are the 1 glass of wine is not going to do anything. Now, you don't want to do it on purpose, but chances are it's not. They have found that alcohol and pregnancy, where you typically find the real bad issues, is with people who drink often and heavily. There's also nicotine, is another big one. The problem with nicotine is it's hard to disentangle nicotine use while pregnant versus nicotine cigarettes in the house after the baby's born, because they go together. So those are the obvious ones. Some other things to think about in terms of prenatal stuff are prescription drugs that people need. Think about this. If you are on antidepressants and you find out you're pregnant, some antidepressants can go through to the developing baby. What do? Which is the lesser of 2 evils? Continuing to take the antidepressants or stopping the antidepressants? Do you see where I'm going with that? If you are on medicine for epilepsy, some of that medicine can go through to the developing baby. Do you really want to stop your medicine and end up having a seizure? That's going to hurt the baby probably more than taking the medicine well. There are medications like that, and there's no perfect answer, but what the answer is working with the OB to figure out where is that sweet spot. In other words, what kind of medication can we give that causes the least amount of harm to the baby and the most amount of good to mom? How do we fix the dosage, and how do we tweak which medicine is given so that we serve both? That's kind of the what you're aiming for. And it's not a perfect system, but that's a big issue when it comes to prenatal development. So that's prenatal. Then we get into infants. Infants, the typical newborn is about 7.5 pounds, about 21 inches, and has that little soft spot in the back of their head, on the top of their head. Infants can be what's called cone heads. If you're born vaginally, okay, the birth process, you have labor, which is the dilation and opening, and then you have where the baby's pushed out, and then you have expulsion of the placenta, are the three things in the birth process. Then you have the newborn. The newborn, if they were born vaginally, they can be what's called a cone head because they were pushed through, and their skull is not completely developed. So they can look like literally a cone head, and that is normal. That will go down, their head will become a more normal shape. So you do see that. You also see, if you're talking about newborn, a couple other things. You have the APGAR scale, which looks at color, respiration, reactivity, and things like that. Your immediate assessment. They do it immediately, and then after a little bit of time has passed, to see if there's any red flags. You have newborn reflexes. You have the grasping reflex, sucking reflex. Newborns also have a walking reflex. You can, if you stand them up and their toes touch a hard surface, they will do this little thing that looks like they're walking. Then you have the rooting, where you scratch their cheek and they move their cheek to get stuff. So you have all these newborn reflexes. You also, another thing with newborns, a couple other things with newborns. You have newborn senses. The sense of vision is the least developed. Did you know newborns can hear and smell and taste even before they're born? How do we know this? Well, when babies are born, they react to their mother's voice. They recognize their mother's voice. They recognize their mother's smell because they've heard it, smelled it. The taste, they like things that their mother ate while she was pregnant. Like if a mom ate a lot of stuff with garlic while she was pregnant, they prefer milk that has a little bit of garlic taste to it. So you can tell by studies they've done to see new preferences, and they have preferences for stuff that's happened even before they were born. So that's newborns. Then we have proportions, sensory capabilities, reflexes. Okay, infancy and childhood. Physical development in infancy and childhood. You develop the most as an infant, and then a lot between age 1 and 3, and then you kind of slow down. But what you see is newborns are all head. So you have this proportion thing. You have newborns that have their head is bigger proportionally to their body than older kids. And as you grow, your body gets proportionally longer and your head is not as much. So for instance, adults, I think their head is about 1/7 of their body, whereas newborns is about 1/3. And that's one of the reasons why newborns have trouble holding their head up, because their head is really big compared to the rest of their body. Physical development. Has anybody ever seen 2-year-olds throw a ball compared to 5-year-olds. Physical development, you see things like sitting up, which is at about 6 months. Walking, when do kids learn how to walk? About a year. On average, kids take their first step. When do kids learn how to talk? Same thing, about a year. They say their first words. So those are kind of the big developmental milestones. Two things that I want to talk about in cognitive development in infancy and childhood are theory of mind, and then we have kind of the language thing. Theory of mind is this idea of understanding that other people may not have the same conceptions. Okay? So, let's say I have this video game. And let's say I say, what do you think is in this video game case? And I say, okay, look, there's nothing in there. Okay? And then I asked the kid, I'm like, you know, she's going to come in. She didn't see what I just did. What do you think she's going to think is in this video game case? Well, 3-year-olds are going to say, she's going to think there's nothing in there. Because they don't have theory of mind. They don't understand that other people may have different conceptions. By age 5, they get it. They're going to say, she's going to be fooled. She's going to think there's a CD. She's going to think there's a game in there. That's theory of mind. Okay? Now we have language. 2 other things that we have in terms of infancy and childhood is attachment and parenting styles. Okay, attachment. And stay with me because, again, this is something that's, lifespan development is a lot of stuff. Attachment is kind of bonding, okay? And what you have is attachment. A lot of it is done with toddlers and their parents. There was a guy named Harlow who did some research on monkeys and looked at, why do monkeys go after their mothers? Is it because they give them food or because they contact comfort? He found out that it's pretty much contact comfort. That he had monkeys that would prefer going to a pretend mother that was comfy than a pretend mother that gave them food. And they also looked at kids that grew up in orphanages where they didn't get contact comfort and they had some real issues. So attachment is kind of that bonding. It has to do with using a parent as a secure base, feeling comfort, sort of that toddler who looks at mom before they go on the slide just to make sure it's okay. That's attachment. Now, a lady named Mary Ainsworth did a thing called the strange situation. And what she did was she brought moms and their toddlers in and had them go through a series of things where a stranger came in and then the mom left and then the mom came back. And then both left, just a bunch of different in and outs. What she wanted to find out is how would they react when mom left and how would they react when mom came back? Secure. Good attachment is the kid shows distress when mom leaves and is comforted when mom returns. In other words, gets comfort from mom. That distress could be as little as, where mom? Just looking for their mom. Or it could be as much as full-blown meltdown. Full-blown crying, I want my mommy. The key is, did they show that they even realized mom was gone? And were they easily comforted when mom came back? Secure is they show some kind of distress at least, but they're comforted when mom gets back. You also have other non-secure attachment styles. You have kids that don't care if mom left, and kids that aren't comforted when mom gets back. They don't take comfort from mom. Okay? So that would be insecure. Insecure, anxious, insecure, avoidant. That's attachment. That's Ainsworth. Also have a lady named Baumrind who did what's called parenting styles. And this is another thing from infancy and childhood. And came up with this idea of parents when they're parenting. Do they have rules and do they show warmth? We have this authoritative, which is both. Parents who have rules, but also are responsive and warm. They will listen. They will make exceptions if needed. Okay? So they have rules, but they're also responsive. Then you have authoritarian, which are parents who, my way or the highway, you're doing it because I said so. So they have the rules, but they would not be considered warm or responsive. Then you have parents who don't have rules, but are warm and responsive. That's a permissive. And basically, I don't want to stifle their creativity. I don't want to tell them no. They can do whatever they want. They need to figure it out. And then you have, and that's permissive, and then you have what's called either indifferent or neglectful, which don't have either. Typically, the parenting style that leads to the best outcomes is the authoritative, where you have rules and you also have warmth. But permissive and authoritarian can work in certain circumstances. It just depends. So that's that. Let's move on to, we have adolescence, emergent adulthood, and death and dying. Stay with me again. Adolescence, some big things. We have puberty, okay? Puberty is the big physical thing in adolescence, and it's basically the pituitary gland sending the message to the sex organs to create hormones, which create secondary sex characteristics. It's this flood of hormones. What you find is that it typically happens earlier in girls than boys. And puberty, people have been going through puberty earlier than they have in the past. So there's kind of this trend over time for earlier puberty. Okay? And you also have this idea of late bloomers and early bloomers. What you find is that for boys, it's a good thing to go through puberty earlier. For girls, it tends to be a negative, because for boys, it's this, they tend to be bigger and stronger, which means they're better at sports. For girls, they go through puberty earlier, they look like they're 16 when they're 12. So they get attention from boys that they are not cognitively ready for. So they get pushed into doing things that they're just not developmentally ready for, because they're still 12. That's why typically early maturation tends to be a positive for boys and a negative for girls. So that's the big thing in terms of adolescence and physical. Cognitive, you have this going into formal operations. You have teenage slang. So you have this hypothetical and more abstract language. There's probably things that teenagers say that I have no idea what they mean. Cognitively, again, you have hypotheticals, abstracts. You have the ability to think in those kind of ways. Okay? Socially, you have the idea of, is adolescence a time of conflict? Well, adolescents tend to have a little bit more conflict than they did earlier, just because they're trying to find their independence, but not much. And typically, conflict with parents tends to be pretty minor. Things like, how late can I stay out? Or what am I going to wear? Things like that tends to be relatively minor, but a little bit more than previously. So it's kind of those things of they're trying to find that independence. You also see a switch in terms of, in adolescence, in terms of spending more time with peers and less time with parents. So that's adolescence. adolescence has been expanding also because people are going through puberty earlier and because we have more education. After adolescence, we have emergent adulthood and adulthood. Emergent adulthood, if I ask college students, are you an adult? A lot of them would be like, because in some ways they are, some ways they aren't. That's what's called emergent adulthood. And it's this in-between stage. And it's this stage of possibilities. It's a stage of finding oneself. It's a stage of you're independent but not quite. That's emergent adulthood. So then we get into adulthood. And what do we find? Physical, cognitive, psychosocial. Well, let's go through some things that you see in adulthood. We have, I'm going to look at my stuff here. I already have the car keys. A big thing for independence in adolescence. One of the things in adulthood, what do I have here? If you see them, bifocals. Very dirty bifocals. What you find is physically, people are at their prime physically during young adulthood. About that 20 to 30 kind of thing. And then middle adulthood, midlife, 40 to 60, you start seeing reading glasses or bifocals, okay? Because you have what's called presbyopia. The lens in your eye is not as flexible, so you can't focus as much. So you see minor things like that. You see you're not quite as strong and quite as fast as you used to be when you're in midlife. However, you don't see any real big declines physically or cognitively. People in midlife may see little things like they can't think quite as fast as they used to. It takes them a little bit longer to figure things out. But what you also see in midlife is that people are at their prime. Think of who are the leaders? People from 40 to 60. Those tend to be the leaders in a lot of organizations because they're old enough that they've had a lot of life experience, but not to the age where they're starting to lose some of those cognitive functioning. So it's kind of that prime, that sweet spot, so to speak. And that's midlife. However, midlife, people are what's going through, heard that midlife crisis. Well, not as much of a thing as you think it is. Very few people go through a true midlife crisis. They go through thinking about, am I where I want to be at this stage? But not to the extent that you see in the movies. You also see there's this thing called the sandwich generation, where you have some people in midlife are taking care not only of their teenager, young adult kids, but their parents who are starting to have health problems. That's midlife. Think about generativity, taking care of everybody, being in charge. Then you have old age. This is where you start seeing some sensory declines, some noticeable sensory declines. You can see some vision things like cataracts, glaucoma, macular degeneration. You can see hearing aids. You can see hearing loss. You can see some loss of taste and smell. So some sensory loss in old age. Some memory loss. There are a few people that get Alzheimer's. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Alzheimer's. That is rare, but a little bit of memory loss touch of memory loss is more common. In developmental psych, if you took a whole class on it, you would get into a lot more detail about what happens to cognition in aging. So, aging. Cognitive intelligence changes. You keep your what's called crystallized intelligence. In other words, you have all those facts that you've known. You tend to keep those for a long time. It's that processing speed that you lose first. Okay? And then last but not least, psychosocial. What happens as you age? Well, older people have what's called socio-emotional selectivity, where older people tend to narrow their social group. They tend to decide, okay, who is the most important for me to hang out with? And they have friends and family, but they don't necessarily care as much about meeting and greeting and meeting new people. They want to spend time with who they get the most out of and who's the most important to them. That's kind of what you find. You also find, I want to talk real quick about relationships and marriages. You have this thing of when you get married, you're way up here, okay? And then your satisfaction declines a little bit when you get into having kids and get into life. And then the kids leave the house, and in a good marriage, it goes back up because you get to spend time with one another again. So by the time you get to late life, if you're still married, a lot of those marriages tend to be very successful and very good. And marriage tends to lead to a lot of positive things in late life. So, last thing in lifespan development is the end of life. What happens at the end of life? Well, I want to go over two kind of big topics and leave you with that. Two kind of big topics at the end of life. One is the idea of hospice, because in our country, there's a lot of this, we want to live. We want to deny death. We don't want it to happen. It used to be that death was more of a natural part of life. Hospice is trying to bring a little bit of that back. Hospice is this idea of giving people more control over death. And this gets into the whole topic of euthanasia and do people have that right? It gets into that whole issue. But hospice is this death with dignity, and the fact of you're moving toward what's called palliative care. You're moving toward your treatment is not necessarily a treatment. It's pain relief. Okay? Making you comfortable. And then last but not least, there's a lady named Elisabeth Kubler-Ross who talked about the stages of death and dying, the stages of if you know that your end is near, what do you go through? A lot of people have heard of this denial, anger, bargaining, okay, depression, acceptance. That's from Kubler-Ross, where you go through, no, I can't have cancer. It can't be me. And then, why me? Not fair. And then, God, if you just give me 6 more months, I'll go to church every Sunday. That bargaining thing. And then depression. And then acceptance. Now, people don't necessarily go through all the stages, and they don't go through all the stages in that order. They can go back and forth and be in any stage. But she is very influential in terms of she spent a lot of time with people who were dying and knew they were dying. So that's Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, lifespan development. Again, we go from the little baby shoes to things like Nerf guns and Toy Story and things like Teddy to things like, again, teenagers playing video games and getting the car keys, okay, to getting married, to spending 50 years together. So it's kind of taking people through a journey and looking at how does human behavior and how do human beings interact and deal with change across the lifespan.